Okay, so when companies talk about climate goals, they often focus on their direct emissions, right? The power they use, the factories.
Yeah, scope 1 and 2. That's the standard starting point.
But the real sort of elephant in the room for most businesses, it seems, is scope three.
Absolutely. That's everything else, the entire value chain.
We're talking material sourcing, suppliers, how customers actually use the products, end of life. I mean, it's huge.
It's the whole shebang, and frankly, it's where the majority of emissions often lie. And it's creating this massive Scope 3 emissions gap.
A gap, meaning what they want to reduce versus what they are reducing.
Exactly. And the scale of that gap right now, well, it's staggering. Think about the total annual emissions of Germany, the UK, and Italy combined.
Wow. Okay. That's significant.
It is. And the projections, they suggest this gap could multiply maybe 5 times by 2030 if things don't change.
5 times. So even if companies nailed their scope 1 and 2, we'd still be way off track because of scope 3.
Precisely. It highlights just how critical tackling scope 3 really is for meeting any kind of global climate targets.
Right. Which brings us to the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, VCMI. They've just launched something called the Scope 3 Action Code of Practice. Sounds like they're trying to step into this gap.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's positioned as a practical framework, a set of best practices.
To help companies keep moving even when hitting those Scope 3 roadblocks.
Yeah, exactly. To help them navigate these complexities and, importantly, maintain climate action momentum, even if direct Scope 3 cuts are proving tough.
And this isn't just VCMI going it alone, is it? I saw some big names supporting this.
Oh, yeah. It's got some serious backing. You've got the International Chamber of Commerce, We Mean Business Coalition, Environmental Defense Fund, the World Economic Forum.
Okay.
And governments, too. The UK, Peru, Panama. It signals that this is seen as a potentially important piece of the puzzle.
So for this deep dive, we really need to unpack this. What is this Scope 3 Action Code? Why does it matter for companies trying to hit their climate targets? And how does it actually propose bridging that huge emissions gap we talked about?
Sounds like a plan.
Let's start then with digging a bit deeper into the Scope 3 challenge itself. You said it's often the majority of emissions.
Easily. The We Mean Business Coalition estimates, I think, it's often over 70% of a company's total emissions. So, you simply can't ignore it if you're serious about climate.
The companies are struggling. You mentioned the gap, but is there data on how many are falling behind targets?
There is. Research from CDP and Bain suggests something like 47% of companies are well behind their Scope 3 reduction goals.
Almost half. Okay, so what's making it so difficult? What are the main barriers?
Well, research, like some recent work by Ramble, points to a few key things. A big one is just the limited availability of suitable low-carbon options across complex supply chains.
So the greener alternative might not exist yet, or it's not scalable, or maybe too expensive.
Exactly. And think about the sheer complexity, engaging hundreds, maybe thousands of suppliers, influencing customer behavior. It's not straightforward.
Right. It's a fundamentally different challenge than changing the light bulbs in your own office.
Completely different scale of complexity.
Okay, so challenge established. Let's pivot to the VCMI's proposed solution, the Scope 3 Action Code of Practice. What's the core idea?
At its heart, it's about providing a structured way for companies to deal with this Scope 3 gap.
How so?
It encourages them, first, to acknowledge the gap exists. Be transparent.
Okay. Hit transparency first.
Then, disclose the specific barriers they're facing. Why can't they reduce emissions faster? And detail what they're actively doing to try and overcome those barriers.
So acknowledge, disclose barriers, show the effort. That makes sense. But it doesn't stop there, right? It involves carbon credits.
Yes, and this is a really crucial part. The code supports using high-quality carbon credits for those Scope 3 emissions that remain after a company has done all it feasibly can on direct reductions.
Ah, so it's in addition to, not instead of direct cuts.
Absolutely critical distinction.
Yeah.
The code is very clear. Credits supplement, they don't supplant, the core job of decarbonizing your own value chain. It's trying to head off greenwashing concerns.
What defines a high-quality credit in this context? That's always a tricky area.
It is. Generally, it means credits from projects that are verified, additional meaning the reduction wouldn't have happened otherwise permanent, and avoid negative unintended consequences. VCMI has its own criteria, building on market standards.
Got it. So use credits for the hard-to-abate stuff, but keep pushing on direct reductions. What's the long-term goal the code sets?
The long view is clear. Companies need to aim to overcome those barriers and get fully back onto a net zero-aligned decarbonization path by 2040 at the absolute latest.
2040. So there's a deadline for relying on this mechanism.
Yes, it's meant to be a transitional approach.
And what's the role of the credits in that transition period between now and potentially 2040?
They act as a bridge for that remaining gap. The idea is to ensure that finance keeps flowing now to climate projects, reduction and removal projects, while the company works on its harder, longer-term Scope 3 solutions. It keeps climate action funded continuously.
Okay, so the code is the framework, but I also saw VCMI launched a Scope 3 Action Challenge alongside it. What's that about? Mobilization?
Exactly. Think of the challenge as the call to arms, maybe.
Yeah.
It aims to drive a big uptick in actual Scope 3 decarbonization work.
So they're recruiting companies and organizations.
Yes, they're calling for signatories, businesses, civil society groups to commit publicly to tackling Scope 3. It's about recognizing and amplifying those who step up.
Building a coalition of the willing? Sort of.
Kind of, yeah. Creating momentum.
What do these signatories actually pledge to do?
There are 4 main commitments in the pledge. First, acknowledging the urgency, the risks of not acting on Scope 3.
Okay.
Second, supporting all credible solutions to speed up decarbonization. Third, committing to transparency and accountability in their own plans and progress.
Right.
And fourth, joining this collective movement, basically agreeing to be leaders, showing ambition and action.
Seems like a good way to foster collaboration and maybe share what works. Who's partnering on this challenge?
It's a pretty broad coalition. You've got the big business groups, again, like the ICC, we mean business, environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy.
And importantly,
Solution providers, too. People like Anthesis, the Carbon Markets Institute, Vera,
yeah,
the ones who can offer practical help and expertise.
that makes sense. You need the tools as well as the commitment. Now, VCMI already had its claims code of practice, right, for how companies make climate claims using credits. Has that been updated too?
Yes, good point. They did review and revise the foundational criteria within that existing claims code.
Foundational criteria.
These are like the baseline requirements companies have to meet to credibly use high-quality credits as part of any climate claim VCMI recognizes. Things like setting science-based targets, demonstrating progress on internal reductions. The basics for credibility.
And these updated criteria now apply to the Scope 3 Action Code as well.
That's right. They form the bedrock for both the general claims and this specific Scope 3 pathway. They wanted to ensure everything aligns with the latest best practices and, importantly, the practical realities companies face trying to reach net zero.
How did they update them?
It involved their expert advisory group, feedback from stakeholders, and significantly, they actually tested the proposed changes with a group of companies to see how they worked in practice.
So it's grounded in real-world application. That's good to hear. Okay, we've got the code, the challenge, the updated criteria. What's the reaction been? Let's talk stakeholder perspectives. You mentioned support from business and governments.
Yeah, quite strong support. Philip Ferran from the International Chamber of Commerce called the code a blueprint for their members, emphasizing how big Scope 3 is for them.
And the UK government.
Kerry McCarthy MP welcomed the ambition and interestingly mentioned the UK is actually consulting on how they might implement aspects of it.
That's significant. What about climate advocates? People like Christiana Figueres.
She was quite clear. She stressed this is not a delay tactic. She sees it as a framework for integrity, using credits only where barriers exist and always alongside deep cuts. Her view is high-integrity credits can actually boost ambition and channel finance effectively.
So framing it as enabling more action, not less.
That's the argument, yes.
And you mentioned Peru and Panama earlier, support from the Global South, too.
Right. Peru's Environment Minister, Juan Carlos Castro Vargas, sees it as a science-based option for those really tough-to-address emissions. And Panama's Juan Carlos Monterrey Gomez highlighted the urgency for Scope 3 action and welcomed the code as a pilot framework.
So a sense of shared need across different regions. Any other interesting takes?
Well, Ravi Menon from Singapore pointed out how high-quality credits can make some decarbonization projects viable that just wouldn't be otherwise economically.
An enabling factor.
Usha Rao Manari, VCMI's chair, really hammered home the need for continuous climate finance, keeping that funding flowing year after year. Pim Valdry at the World Economic Forum framed it as an additional tool for impact, alongside direct decarbonization.
And environmental groups beyond figures.
Leah Borkenhagen from the Environmental Defense Fund welcomed VCMI's efforts for bringing clarity, stressing that need for simultaneous direct cuts and climate finance. Jenny Allen from We Mean Business called it a valuable tool complementing their members' direct efforts.
It's interesting how many emphasize the complementary aspect. What about companies using it? Any perspectives there?
Yeah, Fernanda Facchini from Natra, the cosmetics company, saw it as a credible pathway, apparently helpful for companies maybe earlier on their transition journey, still figuring out Scope 3.
Okay.
And Phil Brady from Emergent, which facilitates forest carbon finance, echoed the idea that direct action is key. But the scale of the crisis means we need all credible tools, including high-integrity credits used responsibly.
Okay, so a lot of alignment around the both-hand approach, direct action and strategic credit use for the remaining gap. Let's try and boil this down for you, the listener. What are the absolute key takeaways from all this?
Number one, Scope 3 emissions are huge, absolutely massive. You can't solve climate change without tackling them. Progress here is non-negotiable for global goals.
Right. It's the biggest piece for many.
Number two, the VCMI's new code offers a structured, transparent way for companies to deal with this complexity, particularly when they hit genuine barriers. It aims for integrity.
And number three is that core strategy.
Exactly. It's about doing both. Push hard on direct emission cuts within the value chain, and strategically use high-quality carbon credits for the emissions that are truly hard to abate right now. It's not one or the other.
The Scope 3 Action Challenge then acts as a catalyst.
Number four, the challenge is there to drive collective action, build momentum, and provide support and resources for companies undertaking this.
And crucially, this isn't about kicking the can down the road.
That's takeaway number five, and maybe the most important nuance. The intent, as expressed by VCMI and supporters, isn't delay. It's about finding credible ways to keep making progress and keep climate finance flowing now, while the longer-term, deeper solutions are developed and scaled.
Okay, so summing up, VCMI's Scope 3 Action Code looks like a serious attempt to provide a practical, integrity-focused framework for companies to tackle the massive, complex challenge of indirect emissions, ensuring climate action continues even when the path isn't easy.
That captures it well. Acknowledging complexity, providing a pathway, and trying to maintain momentum and finance.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. Given that enormous Scope 3 emissions gap we started with, Germany, UK, Italy combined, potentially growing fivefold, what role do you really think voluntary carbon markets guided by frameworks like this code will actually play in getting us to global net zero?
And following on from that, what does this focus on codes, credits, and corporate claims mean for accountability? How do we ensure these commitments translate into real, effective climate action on the ground?
Those are big questions. Definitely something to mull over.
Indeed. The effectiveness of these voluntary mechanisms is really going to be under scrutiny.
If you want to dig into the details yourself, the full Scope 3 Action Code of Practice is on the VCMI website. That's vcmintegrity.org/Scope3Action.
And the Scope 3 Action Challenge Pledge Statement is also there at vcmintegrity.org/Scope3Action Challenge _pledge statement / lots to read if you're interested.